After Dieppe, the Allies abandoned the idea of an invasion of France in 1942. The overriding question then was where to attack the Germans and relieve the pressure on Soviet Russia. Events in North Africa soon provided the answer. In June, Rommel stormed the fortress of Tobruk and pushed the British back to El Alamein, only 60 miles from Alexandria in Egypt. It looked like one more solid Axis offensive would carry them to Cairo. The Suez Canal was directly threatened, and beyond it, the vital oil fields of the Middle East. Churchill recommended a joint operation in North Africa to clear Axis forces from the continent. If successful, the sea lanes through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal would be secure. American military advisors who opposed any operations in North Africa saw the proposal as a thinly veiled British attempt to shore up their colonial interests in the region. Yet in spite of objections, FDR believed it was essential to get U.S. troops in the war against Germany as quickly as possible. And in the end, Roosevelt sided with Churchill for lack of a better alternative. North Africa would be the target for 1942. The plan that took shape was codenamed Operation Torch.
The plan for Operation Torch is an incredibly complex affair. We have forces in place on England, and we have a great deal of forces being built up on the coast of America. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring those forces from England down in one fleet, and at the same time cross the Atlantic with a fleet from the United States to arrive simultaneously off the coast of Africa at 3 different ports: Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca. But they don't want to assault these ports, which are also fairly heavily defended. Frontally, what they're going to do for the most part is land on both sides of the ports and then try to envelop them with pincers. And in that way seize ports to make the support of this lodgment on North Africa much easier from a logistical standpoint.
Operation Torch began in the early morning hours of November 8th, 1942. From the outset, things went wrong. Units landed at the wrong place, landing craft overturned in the surf, and useless supplies reached the beaches from improperly loaded cargo ships. It was a mess, and had the Allies been facing the German army, Torch might have been a catastrophe.
When we landed in North Africa, the invasion of North Africa, we got a break. Our goal was to capture Casablanca, which was already empty of all Germans.
The troops that we were fighting then were French troops, because then France was under German dominion under the government of Pétain.
The hardest part of Torch was not so much getting ashore, although there were a lot of mishaps with that. First of all, not knowing quite how the French would react. But once you're ashore, following up fast enough, because your real objective is Tunis, that's several hundred miles away.
By November 11th, negotiations had succeeded both in ending French resistance and winning French cooperation. And soon, British and American units began pushing east for Tunisia. Rommel's forces, in retreat from El Alamein after a defeat at the hands of Montgomery's Eighth Army, were now threatened from 2 sides. While the Allies rushed light forces forward from Algiers, the Germans reacted with a rapid buildup. The race for Tunisia was on, but it was a contest the Allies were destined to lose.
The American planners really hadn't given much thought to the advance into Tunisia. They'd put a lot more attention into simply getting on the African continent. They wanted to make sure that Torch succeeded, which is logical and reasonable, and really hadn't allocated a whole lot of time or resources to the subsequent advance. They run into lots of problems across a very difficult terrain, challenging mountains, limited road net, and it's winter. That thrown together made for a real logistical nightmare.
Eventually, the Axis brought in more than 150,000 men, and Rommel's troops, falling back before the British, were able to establish themselves behind the so-called Mareth Line in southeastern Tunisia. It was there that the Allied advance was brought to a halt by German resistance and winter rains. The situation hadn't changed when Churchill, Roosevelt, and their senior military advisors met at Casablanca in January 1943. On the agenda was the development of a plan for future operations against the Reich, and once again, the Allies found themselves at direct odds. The Americans pushed for the cross-channel invasion. The British resisted and instead proposed further operations in the Mediterranean.
The Americans believed that if we didn't do it now, the delay was actually going to help the Germans get stronger. They're going to have more time to prepare their defenses. So there's a joke that goes around that the Americans kept on coming up with ways to fight the Germans where they were, and the British kept on arguing for ways to fight the Germans where they weren't.
In the end, FDR deferred to the British and their strategy of chipping away at the periphery. Though Casablanca was the scene of much inter-Allied conflict, it took place in a much improved atmosphere. It was clear that the Germans and Italians in North Africa would be defeated, but there was also significant progress being made elsewhere. In the Atlantic, the U-boat threat was slowly being contained. Though merchant ship losses had risen sharply after America entered the war, a switch to the convoy system reversed the trend, while new construction more than made up for ships sent to the bottom. Furthermore, Allied anti-submarine efforts had driven U-boat losses ever higher. In Russia, where the majority of the German army was fighting, the Soviets had not only absorbed the latest German offensive at Stalingrad, but had unleashed their own attack just 2 weeks after the Torch landings. A twin-armed counteroffensive caught the Germans completely by surprise and trapped the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. But that was only the beginning.
Continuing series of Soviet offensives rolled to the west, destroying the Hungarian Second Army, the Italian Eighth Army, half the German Second Army, half the German Fourth Panzer Army, and pushing the Germans headlong in flight. There was a hole open in the German front as big as the entire Western Front in World War I.
It's pretty noteworthy that the Battle of Stalingrad in the late fall of 1942 and the early winter of 1943 marks the first time in World War II that the Germans have really suffered a major defeat any place. German Sixth Army is lost in what becomes the Soviet encirclement of German forces.
The German Sixth Army, now trapped in Stalingrad, numbered some 300,000 men. Though Goering boasted that the Luftwaffe could supply the besieged army, it proved a hopeless task in the face of winter weather and strong Soviet opposition. When the Sixth Army finally surrendered in February 1943, only 90,000 shattered men remained.
The tremendous damage done at Stalingrad and by other strategic offensives launched in November 42 made it abundantly clear that Germany would lose the war in the Soviet Union. Would it lose the war overall? That was still unanswered.
As the last German troops marched out of Stalingrad and into captivity, in Tunisia, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was plotting his next move. Always aggressive, he designed a counteroffensive against the Allies that would push them away from Tunis and buy time for further reinforcements and supplies to arrive. By choice, his blow would fall on the American troops, who had never seen major combat.
This German counteroffensive that will fall on the American army in the area of the Kasserine Pass is the first test in combat for the American army. Now, a great deal of effort has been put forward by the Americans to prepare equipment, to learn from the Germans and gather doctrine. Now, all these factors are going to come together, and we're going to see how the American army fares in combat.
The 37th Infantry Regiment faced the Germans first, and they broke and ran, and we all had to retreat. They pulled the 37th out, morale gone. You can imagine their feeling, because they knew what had happened, that they'd let us down.
The Germans knocked out something like 98 American tanks because they had superior knowledge, superior practice, and just knocked out our tanks.
The Battle of Kasserine Pass is widely held to show how green and inexperienced American troops were and how ill-suited to combat they were until they'd actually been under fire for a while. And I think it proves exactly the opposite. There were actually about 6 separate actions that made up the entire Kasserine Pass campaign. And in every one of those instances, you had an American force that was usually heavily outnumbered by an extremely competent, very battle-hardened German force, which usually enjoyed air superiority at this stage in the campaign. And when the Americans were pushed back, they usually retired in excellent order and were ready for combat the next day. That's not the behavior of a bunch of amateurs.
By the 22nd of February, the Germans had run out of steam and began to withdraw to their original positions. The counteroffensive had failed, but the impact of the fighting on the Americans was far-reaching.
It's essentially a wake-up call to the American Army that there are some problems of leadership, problems of training, problems with equipment, problems with logistics, probably the biggest ones of all, problems with close air support. I mean, there are a lot of lessons that are learned at Kasserine. Kasserine is a cold slap in the face.
My remembrances of Kasserine Pass were not fond memories, but if you had to be blooded, that was the place to be because it was rough. And we came out of it ready for more.
By mid-April, Axis forces had been pushed into the northeast corner of Tunisia. While Allied forces had gained experience and strength over the last 6 months, Axis units had been increasingly hampered by growing Allied air and naval raids on their supply line from Sicily.
British intelligence got word that the Germans were going to be bringing in a bunch of airplanes, reinforcing the remains of the Africa Corps and evacuating a bunch of equipment. So the 3 American fighter groups down there, along with some Brits, were programmed out there for 15-minute patrols in the area that they would come into Cape Bond. And our outfit was out there for its 15-minute period, and we were halfway home when all of a sudden the radio came alive and we heard all the action starting. Well, we were low on fuel by that point, so we couldn't go back and join the fun, but the 57s just really had a field day.
We were escorting 50 Junkers 52, and over there it looked like a swarm of bees waiting for us. P-51s and Spitfires and you name it. We lost all the airplanes.
For the Germans, Tunis was a foretaste of things to come. From that point on, the Wehrmacht units would have to endure all the torments the full weight of Allied air power could inflict on them.
Tunisia campaign was the last time in its history the U.S. Army had to worry about enemy aircraft. From that time on, we've always operated under complete air supremacy.
The final Allied offensive of the North African campaign began on May 6th, and the next day, Allied troops entered Tunis and Bizerta. They found Axis units in a state of collapse. Resistance in North Africa ended when the Italian First Army surrendered in mid-May. More than 250,000 Axis prisoners were taken. The North African campaign was a valuable learning experience for the Americans, who put their doctrine, their men, and their equipment to the test for the first time.
After the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the British senior officers in North Africa really start sniping at Ike and at the quality and capabilities of the American Army. In fact, there's a reference to the American Army from the British side that they are basically our Italians, in other words, incompetent. Ike overlooked it for the sake of unity, and at the same time, he urged his men and his officers to learn from the British. And what the American Army learns is how to supply the troops in the field and how to employ air support to its best advantage on the battlefield.
Tunisia had clearly shown that to beat the German army, the Allies would need to gain command of the air. This would allow them to isolate the battlefield, cut off the Wehrmacht's source of supplies and reinforcements, and at the same time build up their own logistical system free of serious enemy interference. It was also evident that future Anglo-American operations would need to have a stronger, more cooperative command structure.
The Allied command structure that is initially used in North Africa is a little convoluted. We have confused chains of command that cross national boundaries going from American to British back and forth, and it causes some real problems. So they revised this command structure. So you're going to have higher headquarters, which will have combined commands, British and American officers working together effectively. The commander will be from one nationality, the assistant commander will be from the other. The staffs will be woven together. But the combat units will retain their integrity, and they will be one nationality or the other.
Operation Torch and the North African campaign laid the foundation for all future Anglo-American amphibious operations. The Allies were beginning to hit their stride, but they had yet to prove just how powerful they might become. In July 1943, an Allied invasion fleet, numbering more than 2,500 ships and carrying close to 500,000 men, sailed from North African ports. Led by General Dwight Eisenhower, it was the greatest Allied armada the war had yet seen. The target, Sicily, had been the source of much contention between the Allies at the Casablanca Conference back in January. The Americans saw this as a useless diversion from a cross-channel invasion, but the British had a different view.
For one thing, if you take Sicily, you pretty much cleared the transport across the Mediterranean. That means you've opened up the supply routes into Egypt, India, and this is important for the conduct of the war effort for the British Empire. Sicily has the advantage as well within air range of your air bases in North Africa, and you have a chance to knock Italy out of the war, so that it becomes kind of politically important.
Perhaps the most persuasive argument was that the forces were already in place and would not have to be redeployed. In the end, FDR again deferred to the British. Preparations for Operation Husky, the code name for the invasion of Sicily, began immediately after the Casablanca Conference. 7 divisions were to wade ashore along a 100-mile front in southeastern Sicily, while elements of 2 airborne divisions landed behind Axis lines, the first large-scale use of airborne troops by the Allies.
The island of Sicily is being held by between 200,000 and 300,000 Axis troops. The Italian commander doesn't have enough people to adequately defend everywhere along the coast. So he chooses to concentrate his limited number of mobile troops in the center of the island and use that reserve to react to the Allied landing wherever it occurs.
The invasion got off to a rough start as a fierce storm whipped up the sea and seriously endangered some of the smaller craft.
And so happened we blundered into what they called a 100-year storm right off the bat. It was one of the worst storms I had ever seen, and of course I hadn't seen very many, but come morning the storm let up a little bit, and it wasn't long before we were approaching the south coast of Sicily.
Arriving in poor weather so quickly after the fall of North Africa combined to take the Axis completely by surprise.
There was no resistance at my beach. It's called Yellow Beach. It was 2 or 3 miles east of the town of Licata, what Americans call it Licata, of course.
The port we invaded was not defended, so we met little resistance there and were able very quickly to set up our operation to run Gila as a port.
While the beach landings went smoothly, the unexpected storm and pilot error caused the initial airborne portion of the invasion to be widely scattered.
I had no concern but what we were going to be where we were supposed to be. It was pretty obvious quickly that we weren't.
We were supposed to parachute into the south central part of Sicily, but unknowns to me, I was on the wrong end of the island, and nobody told us that the British were going to be on the Syracuse end of the island. We didn't know the British were supposed to be there. They didn't know we were supposed to be there because we weren't supposed to be. So there were some cases of firing at each other and killing allies, you might say.
When we went out the door, you saw lots of parachutes in the air. When you got on the ground, you couldn't find a soul. getting together at night was one of our major chores. We did finally get about 30 or 40 people together within an hour.
The paratroops, forced to operate in small, isolated groups, created considerable confusion in Axis rear areas, attacking patrols and cutting communication lines. July 11th, the second day of the invasion, saw